Well, if you were looking for a luxury car in 1974 on a budget, then this 1974 Ford LTD Brougham should certainly have been on your list. 1974 was just one calendar year after the 1973 OPEC oil embargo, and full-size cars had become a bit passé by that point, simply because they tended to burn quite a lot of fuel. However, a number of buyers still opted to go for full-size vehicles that year, and Ford ended up selling about 80,000 LTD Broughams across three body styles: the hardtop coupe, which you see here, the hardtop sedan, or four-door, which was the rarest of all of them, and the four-door sedan, which had a pillar in the middle. The combined sales of those vehicles for 1974 was about 80,000 units, down from about 140,000 units for the three LTD Broughams in 1973. But it was still a rather good showing for the LTD Brougham in a year in which a number of individuals were just not interested in buying full-size vehicles. 1974 saw a number of stylistic revisions to the vehicle as well, most prominently this new front end and the stand-up hood ornament came back. The overall front end, I think, was a bit more tasteful than the 1973 model that you can see here, where the grille texture just isn't quite as luxurious and rich as it is here in the 1974 model. And at least I personally like how the grille spills out around the headlights and the wraparound turn signal, which also serves as the side marker lights. The LTD for 1974, and indeed since the 1971 launch of the car off of its existing platform, rode atop a 121-inch wheelbase. The Mercury's rode atop a 124-inch wheelbase, and the Lincoln's a 127-inch wheelbase. So the more you paid, the more car you got, but the LTD was still a full-size car and had generous room on the inside, at least if you were not procuring a coupe, where the overall greenhouse and daylight opening created by the windows was rather small and squinty. These cars, compared to General Motors coupes of the era, and certainly the Chrysler Fuselage era coupes, really don't have an open and airy feel inside the cabin. You have to get a pillared four-door sedan or even the four-door hardtop to get a similar feel. As I mentioned, in 74, the LTD Brougham sold about 80,000 units, and that was in part due to the fact that the car did burn a lot of gas. These cars weighed about 4,300 pounds by the 1974 model year, in part because they had some pretty robust bumper systems to meet the 5-mile-an-hour impact standards front and rear. By comparison, in 1971, the LTD Broughams weighed about 4,000 pounds to 4,100 pounds. So over just a few short model years, they had gained a couple hundred pounds overall, and unfortunately, the engines also became less powerful over that time period. In 1971, Ford was still running high compression engines, and the industry was reporting horsepower figures in SAE gross horsepower ratings, which were ratings that were taken with the engine on a dynamometer, excluding accessories, air cleaner, and exhaust. They were relatively unreliable, and in some cases, manufacturers just kind of moved them up or down versus their true values. Whereas by 1974, all engines were rated on SAE net horsepower, which included those accessories, air cleaner, and exhaust. However, by that point, all of the engines under hood in the 1974 LTD were also low compression engines compared to the high compression engines in 1971, so they did generally lose some power. Under hood in this 1974 LTD, you could get three engine choices: the 351 cubic inch V8, which made 162 horsepower, the 400 cubic inch V8, which made 170 horsepower, or the top dog 460 V8, which made 220 horsepower. The astute Ford lovers will note I didn't list a 429 cubic inch V8 as an option. That was sunset after the 1973 model year, where in that particular model year, buyer could opt for a 351, a 400, a 429, or a 460. So there were four engine options in 1973 compared to just three engine options in 1974. This would also be the last model year where the 351 cubic inch V8 was the Cleveland engine. In 1975, the LTDs would get the 351M, or modified engine, as standard, which was derived off of the 400 engine. So for those who don't know, Ford actually had three different 351 cubic inch engines: the Cleveland, the Windsor, and the M, or modified. And yes, they are all different. We'll get into the subject of why Ford did that as a topic of another video. Turning now to the inside of the 1974 LTD Brougham, this was a year that was a bit of a letdown for previous LTD owners. In 1973, the LTD got a new dashboard, which was the same in 74, except in 74, the speedometer pointer and the index pointer for the transmission, shift selector, and the fuel gauge were all red, versus in 1973 they were white indicators, presumably changed because it was much easier to read a red indicator versus a white indicator when the lettering itself was white. Regardless, as I said, in 1973, the LTDs got this new dash that you see here, and it was shared with Mercury's, although it did have a different top pad in the Mercury's, and a little bit different format overall. But the speedometer cluster and the warning lights and those items were the same, as were the steering wheels. This is a cruise control wheel with the buttons on the wheel and the rim blow function for the horn. If you got the standard wheel, it was also a two-spoke, but it did not have the cruise control buttons, and it did not have the rim blow feature. Unfortunately, this IP was not as rigid in structure as the 1971 and 72 version, and they can be a little bit creaky. Not quite sure why, if the structure underneath it is a bit different, I'm presuming, versus the 71 and 2 models. And sometimes when you go over bumps, you do hear some creaks. It's not bad or necessarily offensive, but it's just not quite the same as the 71 and 72 models. You did get this supersized glove box over on the passenger side, which was also a feature on the Mercury's. 1974 also saw a change to the door panels. The button pattern that you see there with the biscuit pleating was common to the 73s, but the armrest had changed and the door handle location was also different. The 73s have a recessed door handle that's square in form, and in 74 they moved the door handle up near the armrest here, and it's easier to activate. In 1974, however, there was a rather sad event that would happen with respect to the interior, and that was the loss of the high back bench and twin comfort lounge seats. You can see here, this is the 1974 twin comfort lounge seat option that has the armrests in the middle there and the split bench seat. But the seat backs are no longer high back with integral headrests. They have now these separate headrests, and they're just not quite the same. I love the high back bench seats that Ford offered in its full-size vehicles from 1971 to 73. They're supremely comfortable. You can see here, taking a look at my 1973 LTD Brougham, just why. I mean, look at how comfortable this seat is, and it is really as comfortable as it looks. Unfortunately, as I said, 73 would be the last year for that. I believe Ford had some complaints, particularly from ladies who had ponytails, that they didn't like that seat back that would press against their head. It's funny that that was a complaint, because nowadays most every headrest sits very, very close to one's head because of safety regulations and standards. So I guess it was coming just at a later point in time. You can also see in this photo the door release handle, which is beneath the armrest, which had changed by 1974 to a more convenient location. So what's it like to own one of these 1974 LTD Broughams? Well, I will say that Ford had an ad campaign that started around this time that said, "The closer you look, the better we look." And the premise was that if you look more closely at a Ford, you'd see that it was better assembled and put together than other competitive makes. And to be honest, that was true. All of the Fords that I own from this era have relatively good gaps. The paint finish is pretty good. And when you look at a contemporaneous GM or Chrysler vehicle, I honestly can't say that. Beyond that, Ford's always had this really great door closure sound, and the door hinge pins tend not to sag. And that was especially common on the General Motors vehicles in particular of the era. Overall, the powertrains in the LTD Brougham are quite nice. Some of the 400 cubic inch engines did have lower end oiling problems and oil pressure problems at higher mileages, which ended up spilling over into the 351M engines. But the 351 Cleveland, the 460, and even the 400, so long as you're not buying one with higher mileage, are going to be just fine and very pleasant to drive. The cars also have a wonderful ride quality about them, something that you just couldn't get in a GM or Chrysler. These Fords ride sublimely quiet, and they also have just this pillowy soft ride unless you get the heavy-duty suspension. So overall, I would say for a very, well, today, cheap collectible classic, it's a great buy. For whatever reason, these LTD Broughams are still pretty underappreciated in the marketplace. You can pick up a nice one at the top end if it's a coupe with really low miles and mint condition, probably for around $12,000 to $15,000. And a mint condition sedan with the pillar in it, you could probably still pick one up for under $10,000. So they're a great value and just a wonderful driving collectible. Hope you enjoyed this spotlight on the 1974 LTD Brougham. If you did, be sure to like, comment, and subscribe, and check out the video thumbnails at bottom left and right for some suggestions for you.